The time is just gone 9:34 a.m. We continue with the broadcast this morning, and we're taking a look at the fall or the demise of a new frame. Now, this publication was abruptly stopped, and also there are just so many issues that have actually come out when one unpacks as to why this publication has fallen and what has led to the demise of the publication. We joined on the line this morning by investigative journalist Micah Reddy. Micah, good morning to you and welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yes, Mika, we've got just so much to basically unpack as far as new frame goes. There's a lot of evidence that is now coming out in the open with regard to the donor and the publication being held hostage by the donor, and also just looking at this abrupt announcement that the publication is shutting shop.
Yeah, a lot is coming to light. Look, the donor is a very wealthy American businessman who made his money in tech, a man named Roy Singham. And we first started looking into him some years back. There were all sorts of allegations. You see, he was very involved, or appeared to be very involved in NUMSA, and a kind of constellation of organizations around NUMSA that he had helped set up, or that his money was funding. And there were all sorts of allegations that his money, that the funding was very murky, and it was having quite a negative influence within NUMSA, that it was being used in a sort of factional way to prop up an increasingly unaccountable leadership around Irvin Jim. Um, anyway, we didn't end up publishing anything on Singham back then, although we did look into NUMSA, and we published we published an investigation looking at other aspects of NUMSA and alleged abuse of power and mismanagement of funds and that sort of thing. But Roy Singham was someone who was kind of on our radar. And then, excuse me, he also funded New Frame. And New Frame was among these organizations kind of linked, kind of within this sort of this ecosystem around NUMSA, this kind of left activist ecosystem. And so when New Frame suddenly announced its closure just a few weeks back, it came as a major surprise because it came as a surprise to the journalists themselves, because just months before, Richard Pitthouse, the editor of New Frame, had promised funding for 20 years, that they were secure for 20 years. It was known that Roy Singham was pretty much the sole funder of New Frame. They may have got funding, little bits and pieces of funding from elsewhere, but he really was the sole benefactor. And so Pitthouse was telling journalists, "Don't worry, we're sorted. We're basically sorted for life. Your jobs are fine. The funder loves us. We're all good." And then months later, suddenly the funding was pulled altogether. And so New Frame journalists were left kind of shocked by this news. And all sorts of questions then started emerging about this funder and his intentions for closing New Frame. And that led us, it gave rise to a whole lot of questions. Why has the money suddenly been pulled? And there were all sorts of allegations from journalists who understandably were outraged. And in that climate, I mean, as it is sort of in those left circles, there's a lot of conspiracy going around. And it's quite a sort of fractious climate. And after New Frame, there were all sorts of allegations going around about the funder, about Richard Pitthouse and the management of New Frame, allegations of censorship and all that sort of thing. Lots of back and forth that got quite heated, quite messy. A lot of it was very detailed. And so, we asked questions around these allegations of censorship. I can tell you more about that later. But also, why did the funder suddenly pull all the funding? Yeah, and New Frame had been flush. I mean, they had been getting a lot of money from this fund over the years. For an organization of that size, they were getting, they were really well off in a media environment where, where media organizations are struggling, there are cutbacks, there are layoffs across the board kind of thing. Media organizations are closing. and really struggling to stay afloat. And New Frame kind of seemed like this exception. They were getting something like 30 million a year to run an organization of 24 people. So that gave rise to all these questions and this investigation that led us down some quite interesting sort of rabbit holes.
Well, clearly, and as you pointed out, 30 million, and that is what the figure we've seen, 122 million over a 4-year period. But also at the same time, you speak about Richard Pitthouse, and the alarm bells surely should have sounded, because this is unusual. It's unheard of, where you have someone who can confidently say that we've secured funding for a period of 20 years, and that is not the norm. That is very, very unusual, and that should have raised some alarm bells at that point in time already, Mika.
Absolutely, it should have. And I mean, I think, part of what's interesting here is that this organization was beholden to pretty much one funder, to Roy Singham. And that poses all sorts of risks for, I mean, particularly for when you're looking at media nonprofits, it poses risks for independence, and editorial independence. And so, one of the allegations that was doing the rounds was that there had been no meaningful attempt to try and source funding from alternative sources to diversify revenue streams. And we asked the question: well, was this deliberate? Why, why did New Frame management not go out there and look for alternative funding? Pitthouse says that they did, but it seems he hasn't made a very compelling case for that. And journalists said that they tried to take initiative and suggest ways of diversifying funding, and there was no meaningful attempt to kind of follow up on that. And so, one has to ask, was this something that was by design? And one of the questions that cropped up in this investigation was about, one of the questions that sort of that led to was, what was this sort of for political reasons? Was the organization killed for political reasons? And was the funding, was the pretty much total dependence on one funder something that was by design and a way of kind of controlling New Frame? And the investigation suggests that New Frame was very much, as I'd mentioned, part of this kind of ecosystem, this network, very much centered on Roy Singham, or at least on his funding. And if you look at all these different organizations that we mentioned in the article that are part of this network, I mean, they all seem very much tied to Singham. Okay, NUMSA is a big, massive trade union, but it does, at least the current sort of leadership of NUMSA seems very close to Singham, and all these different organizations that kind of hover around NUMSA that sort of very much seem to be shaping its kind of its ideological worldview, especially when it comes to international issues. Were very much a product of Singham's largesse. And so it seemed, when New Frame collapsed, there were all these allegations of Chinese influence and a pro-China line, because over the last few years, Singham has moved closer and closer to China. Now he has a very global footprint, but he has moved his businesses, it seems, from the US to China, and appears to be close to the Chinese Communist Party. And if you look at the other organizations, the media organizations he's linked to, they do appear to be kind of towing a pro-China line and pushing a lot of kind of Chinese Communist Party talking points. And there were allegations that there was this kind of propagandistic agenda at work here, and that Singham is tied to kind of to state actors and the propaganda apparatus of the Chinese Communist Party. And if you look at these other organizations, there does seem to be a kind of a line. There seems to be a pro-China editorial line that uncritically promotes the Chinese line on several key issues. China has been very keen to kind of has very actively been trying to burnish its image abroad, as great powers do, and is doing that. And in doing that, murky funding and all that sort of thing comes into it. And Royce Singham's organizations were clearly pushing the Chinese line on things like the persecution of ethnic Uyghurs, Hong Kong, Tiananmen Square, all the main kind of critical talking points were very much in line, in lockstep with the Chinese party state. Now, New Frame seemed to be a little bit different in all of that. It seemed, there were all these allegations of censorship and editorial pressure and that kind of thing. But Richard Pitthouse did make a compelling case, well, a somewhat persuasive case. I think it all, is yet to be determined. And a lot of this has been aired publicly. Former journalists have been accusing him of censorship in quite public ways, and he's pushed back against that. So there've been claims and counterclaims in the media, on social media, etc. But he did make a case that there wasn't any kind of active censorship, and there's little evidence to show that he was sort of very actively pushing or enforcing a pro-China line, or a line that was aligned to the Russian and Chinese states. Russia also comes into it, which begs the question: did this was New Frame a victim of that, of its relative independence? Was it killed because it was no longer politically useful, because, say, journalists were sort of demanding their independence and pushing back against certain editorial decisions? Was it no longer useful because it didn't quite fit with this group of organizations, this network that was increasingly influenced by the political interests of this one donor? And it is a little bit inconclusive. A lot of this is circumstantial evidence, but the problem is that Pitthouse, the funder is very much is very much in the background. Doesn't really he doesn't seem to be much of a public figure. Shies away from media engagements and that sort of thing, or at least seems to have in the last while. And Pitthouse hasn't, he's very vociferously defended his editorial decisions and such, but he hasn't taken his own staff, or now ex-staff, and the public into confidence around issues of funding. And so it raises all these questions that we think need to be answered. I mean, there's a legitimate public interest in all of this, and we're interested in money, power, and politics, and how that influences the media and society. And he just has not been forthright about these funding issues. So was New Frame killed because it didn't kind of fit in with this pro-China network? Possibly. That's the conclusion of the article. It ends on a question, unfortunately, but that is what a lot of investigative journalism is.
Well, certainly it does end on a question, because there seems to be a lot more questions than answers at this point in time. And even with the demise, I'm certain that a lot more questions will be raised, a lot more investigative journalism will take place to try to at least get to the bottom of what had actually happened and what the true story is, Mika. But for now, unfortunately, we have run out of time. But thank you for taking time out, talking to us this morning. All the best to you.
Thanks very much.
Micah Reddy joining us this morning with the demise of Newsframe. And with that, we're going to go for a break. We come back, and the final discussion this morning, we're looking at Dudu Myeni pleading guilty, fined for naming Mr. X at the Zondo Commission for state capture.